We're live.
Hello, everyone. I am not only happy, but excited about today's webinar, where we are going to visit virtually and go all the way to Oracle, Arizona, and we're going to visit Biosphere 2, the world's largest control environment dedicated to understanding the impacts of climate change. We will go through the infrastructure of the whole facilities and what they are doing there. Fortunately, we have people much more knowledgeable about this issue. So I will stop talking, give the floor to Rosa, who will make a more official, let's say, introduction. And I will just sit back and enjoy the virtual visit. Again, thank you, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Nikos, for the introduction. Thank you, Kevin, for being here with us. I think that for a scientist who heard about the biosphere, which is basically all astrophysics, physicists, I think, and biologists and geologists and people, you know, in the world of science have heard about Biosphere 2. And I had the privilege of meeting Kevin some years ago before COVID. And I couldn't believe when he said, "Oh, I'm Kevin. I'm from the Biosphere 2." So, wait, you're from what? Where? And that was like a very nice surprise. And then we learned that you know, all the science and all the amazing things that they are doing there. And Kevin is a very good presenter and gave us a virtual ride to the place. And I thought that for you guys here in Learning from the Extremes, well, Kevin is going to show us extremes inside the same building and how humans could survive in other worlds, or even better than that. And this is the most impressive surprise to me, was what we are learning about our planet because of the biosphere. So that was really amazing. But I'm not going to take more time from Kevin. Kevin, I really appreciate you taking your time to be here with us. I know that I'm sure that this visit will be seen by many, many people, many students, and it might, it will for sure inspire several careers in science and exploration. So thank you very much for being here with us. And I pass the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rosa and Nikos, and welcome everyone. We're excited to have you at Biosphere 2 today. I believe it's roughly 5 p.m. in the afternoon or evening in Europe, and it's about 8 o'clock in the morning here. So if I reference morning, don't be confused. It is our morning here in Southern Arizona. And let me introduce a couple of other folks that we have with us here today. And I'm going to turn my camera around. And first up, we have my daughter, Summer, who is going into high school next year and is here to keep us on track and make sure that we're talking at the appropriate level. And if there's questions that, that we're not answering or things that come up, she can help us stay at the right level. And then we also have Leah Crocker, who's one of our scientists at Biosphere 2. And Leah works mostly on our ocean research. And so she will be part of our introduction and presentation today. And then we're all here to help answer questions as well. So let me turn it back around and maybe ask the folks that are on the meeting, just let me know, what country are you from? And what grades and subjects do you teach? I'd love to see just some sense of who we're talking to today. And if you can put it in the chat, that might be the easiest way for us to do this efficiently. And I'll give folks just a couple minutes to do that. We have Portugal training teachers from all over the world. Thank you, Rosa.
Hello.
Hello, Paulo.
Olá.
Welcome. Paulo, ele pede para colocar no chat de qual é o seu país e o que é que leciona.
Ok, obrigado.
Thank you for translating, Rosa. I appreciate that.
No problem.
All right. another Portugal training teachers as well. We have a Greek teacher, physics, geography, and biology. We have Norway, professor at a teacher training university teaching STEAM education. Portugal, chemistry and physics to 12 to 15-year-olds. Greece, preschool teacher. Okay, so we have all sorts of representation from
Kevin,
all over. Yes.
in YouTube, you have another teacher from Portugal also teaching English teacher for 3rd to 6th grades.
Excellent, excellent. Well, one of the things, and thank you for mentioning that English teacher, one of the things that I think is really useful about using Biosphere 2 as a teaching tool is the opportunities to teach across the curriculum. There's so many different questions and intersections of disciplines and topics that it's easy, for example, to have students write essays about what it would be like to live inside Biosphere 2. And so you can connect some of the STEM or STEAM disciplines with English or history or other social sciences. So let me get started on kind of an introduction to the facility. And what we're in is a 2-acre closed facility. Physics teacher from Romania, welcome. More Portugal, lots of great educators. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for being here today. So Biosphere 2 was built to be able to replicate the ecosystems and the natural functions that we find on planet Earth, which is Biosphere 1. So we've all been living on Biosphere 1 our entire lives. And the idea behind Biosphere 2 was to be able to create a closed system separate from the rest of Earth and see if we could understand enough about the processes and mechanisms in order to keep different kinds of ecosystems, from a rainforest to a savanna to an ocean, functioning, and also produce enough food and nutrients and calories for people that were living inside in the early 1990s. And today we do research mostly without involving people inside, other than as technicians and scientists, not as people living inside. And the questions that we can ask and answer have to do with ecosystem function and the scale that is not usual for scientific experiments, because at 2 hectares, this is much, much bigger than what you typically find in a laboratory. And we can have systems that are much more complex and therefore more realistic, but we can still have a lot of control like we would find in a laboratory. So if we think about, for example, the movie The Martian, how many people have seen The Martian? Can I get a show of hands maybe, if you've seen that movie with Matt Damon? All right, I've got a few folks, some green checks. All right, so in the movie The Martian, Matt Damon is stranded on Mars, sort of accidentally, as his crew leaves, and he's forced to try and grow his own food. And a lot of the movie is spent with him trying to figure out how to have the right conditions for growing potatoes as his primary food source. And so if we think about the different conditions that are necessary for growing potatoes, you start to think about, okay, what are the conditions necessary for life on Earth? And what are the conditions that we need to try and recreate inside Biosphere 2 in order to keep people and ecosystems alive and functioning? So if we think about these different resources or variables, well, one of them is we need to have some water for the plants to grow, right? So we need to have water, and the water's got to be in liquid form, and the temperature has to be appropriate for the plants to grow and for the water to be in liquid form. We need to have carbon dioxide for photosynthesis to take place. We need to have a light source so that the plants can do photosynthesis. And we need to have oxygen available for the cells inside the plants to be able to do their function, cellular respiration, just like we humans need oxygen. And so that's a lot of different conditions that you need to maintain. And obviously it was a lot harder on Mars because the temperatures were so much different than they are on Earth. But if you think about a large greenhouse, and I'm going to turn my camera around. If you think about a large greenhouse in the sun in southern Arizona, right? We're about an hour's drive from the border with Mexico. This is the Sonoran Desert. It's very hot in the summer. And so one of the challenges here was maintaining the temperature when it got very hot and heated up inside. So we spent a lot of energy maintaining the temperature inside Biosphere 2 when it was sealed up with 8 people living inside in the early 1990s. Now, part of the reason this site was selected for building this 2-hectare research structure was that there was a lot of light because we needed the light for the plants to grow inside. And so here we are looking at some of the vegetation in what we call the upper savanna. And we're going to take you later to look at the ocean. We're going to look at the rainforest, which is over here behind this barrier, and we'll go inside the rainforest. And then we'll take a walk down to the lower savanna and talk a little bit about some of the plants that are there, as well as the mangrove, which we have inside this building, which is a very important ecosystem type around the world. And as we do this tour, I want you to think about a couple of key things. The first is a couple of terms, scale and control, right? So like I mentioned before, what's special about Biosphere 2 is the large scale and the level of control like a laboratory. So we can ask and answer questions that help connect what we observe in the natural world to what we observe on the laboratory bench or in a small laboratory setting. We can connect those dots, which is a very important role and function of Biosphere 2. The other thing we can do is we can make conditions inside Biosphere 2 look like what we think the future of planet Earth will look like. So what is the temperature going to be like? What's the precipitation or rainfall going to be like? How much water is going to be available? And then how do ecosystems respond to those changing conditions? So if we think about those things, scale, control, and the ability to make the conditions look like 2050 or 2075, we can ask and answer a lot of questions about what's going to happen on planet Earth as climate changes. So why don't we take a little bit of a walk inside Biosphere 2? Right now, we're in the kitchen. I'll show you this first. We're in the kitchen area. This is the dining room where folks who were inside in the early 1990s ate, and they had to grow all of their own food and process and cook their own food in this kitchen right here. Here's a picture of those folks when they were inside in the 90s, having a meal that they prepared out on a balcony overlooking the farm where they grew their food, which is also under glass. And here we have a little bit more detail of food preparation. And there's a very interesting TED Talk by a woman named Jane Pointer. Jane Pointer was one of the folks that was inside Biosphere 2 in the early 90s. And if I look at this picture here, I'm pretty sure Jane Pointer is one of these two folks right here. And she does a TED Talk where she talks about the challenges of getting a pizza inside Biosphere 2. So you can't call Domino's Pizza and have a pizza delivered in 30 minutes. You need 6 months to grow the wheat and make your flour. You need to grow your tomato plants and make your marinara sauce. You need to have goats and keep them alive to get milk to make cheese. And so a pizza doesn't take half an hour, it takes half a year. And I think if we all knew more about how our food actually came to our plates, we would do a better job of helping to maintain the planet. Because it's all of these systems on planet Earth that make it possible for us to grow and eat the food that sustains us. Now here we're looking over the orchard. And the orchard is a space where a number of different food trees were grown. There were bananas, citrus, so lime and lemon. There's fig. There was guava. Lots of different foods that that we enjoy, and the bananas were one of the most treasured treats inside Biosphere 2 because it was one of the sweetest things that they had, and otherwise they didn't have a lot of sugary treats to eat. All right, we're going to leave the dining area. And we're going to head into I'm going to follow Leah and Summer. We're moving into the upper Savannah. You can see there's a river that is moving through this facility, coming from the rainforest and headed down through the biosphere. If you look at the infrastructure, you can see that we have a very interesting space frame design. And there's about 6,000 windows that make up the outside of Biosphere 2. And so it can be sealed from Biosphere 1. And one of the things that becomes important, and I'm looking at the ocean for you now as well, and the beach over here at this end. One of the things that becomes very important when you think about a greenhouse in the sun in southern Arizona is the fact that the temperature, like I said, can increase dramatically. So you have to spend a lot of energy trying to cool things off. But it also means that as the temperature fluctuates, the volume of air inside the building wants to change, right? If you think of the ideal gas law, pressure times volume equals NR temperature. So if we think about let's assume that the number of moles of gas and the ideal gas constant are approximately fixed. You get pressure times volume equals temperature. And so if the temperature goes up, then pressure times volume has to go up. And most of us live in places where the volume doesn't change and the pressure doesn't go up because the building leaks. But if the building doesn't leak and the temperature goes up, then you start to drive up the pressure and you can let the volume change. So one of the engineering solutions was to create what are called lungs. They're these dome structures that allow for a change in the volume of air inside Biosphere 2, which kept the windows from either exploding out or imploding in. But unfortunately, we don't have connectivity to take you down into the lung. But I just wanted to explain that challenge of having a sealed greenhouse in the sun in southern Arizona. So let me turn it over to Leah to talk to us a little bit about the ocean. Leah?
All right, is my audio coming through well? Awesome. Okay, so we're looking down at the Biosphere 2 ocean. It's a 2.6 million liter Caribbean coral reef model ecosystem. And originally, when the biosphere was established in the early 90s, this reef was thriving with over 200 different species that you would commonly see on a coral reef. So lots of types of corals, of fish, of different invertebrates that create the healthy coral reef ecosystem. And if you look at it today, you don't see the colorful, vibrant reef. You don't see living coral. You see a lot of algae. So what has happened is after the closed missions where people lived inside had come to an end, scientists started using the biosphere and taking advantage of its closed atmosphere to do studies where, as Kevin mentioned, we can project the future of the planet. And so in the late 90s, one of the first things that they did was increase the atmospheric CO2 to projected future levels, which are actually similar to the levels we're experiencing today in the 2020s. And this is how they discovered that when atmospheric CO2 increases, you experience ocean acidification. So the CO2 in the air drives down the pH of the ocean, and that has negative consequences on coral reef environments. We are also now seeing stresses due to temperature increases in the ocean that are causing reefs to decline rapidly. We estimate about 50% of our coral reef environment on the planet Earth has been lost due to these temperature and acidification stress events. And what happens is the coral, which coral are an animal that have a calcium carbonate skeleton that contain within their tissue a type of microalgae that lives with them in a symbiotic relationship. So that algae performs photosynthesis and provides energy to the animal that is the coral. And when these coral are under stress, they expel the algae, and it's the algae that gives them their color. But when they expel the algae, you see straight through the coral tissue to the skeleton. And that is what, when you hear about coral bleaching, that is what that is referring to. And as I mentioned, the microalgae living in the coral tissue is the main way that the coral gets its energy. So without that microalgae, the coral's in a very vulnerable state. And that's how our reefs are dying off so quickly. And once the coral are gone, algae and other pest species take over. And so we now have this degraded state reef in front of us at Biosphere 2 that looks a lot like what reefs today are looking like and what we're projecting further into the future more reefs are going to be experiencing. So with the scale and control that we have here at the Biosphere 2 ocean, we're able to do experiments where we can manipulate those variables of temperature and acidification and stress events to do experiments and get valuable information about how these ecosystems can recover. So over the past several years, we've been introducing beneficial species to this degraded reef, which includes many species of fish that are herbivores and can help eat up a lot of this algae. We've also been having to take algae out ourselves by hands, having divers go down and pull out the algae. And we're trying to recover the state of this ecosystem to be a healthy reef once again. And currently, we're in the process of undergoing some engineering renovations that will allow us to bring coral back. So an interesting thing about Biosphere 2 is that our glass here doesn't let through UV light, and it cuts the visible spectrum of light to about 30 to 50% of what it is outside. And so, as I mentioned, the microalgae needs light to perform photosynthesis. So that's not enough light for coral to be sustained. So we're installing lights over this ocean, and then we have control over the lighting on our reef system. And we also will have the equipment available to do ocean acidification experiments. We can adjust the pH manually to see what the threshold is for certain species. We also have a highly efficient heat exchanger that allows us to change this whole 2.6 million liters of water by 2 degrees Celsius over 24 hours. That's a very dramatic change in temperature for these creatures to experience. So what we're hoping to do in the near term is we have coral right now growing in the basement of Biosphere 2 in systems called raceways. And these raceways contain small coral fragments that are typically how we are restoring coral reefs today. So coral can actually be fragmented into small pieces, and they'll grow off of those small pieces faster than they would if you planted a larger piece out on a reef. So using our coral fragments, we can introduce them to the Biosphere 2 ocean and do these experiments where they're undergoing stress events, and that will inform these restoration efforts on what species or genotypes they should be focusing their efforts on, or if it has to do with the symbiont, the type of microalgae that is in the coral, if that's what gives them more resilience. We're able to discover what it is that's providing corals resilience, and then we'll have a higher success rate when we restore reefs out in the ocean today.
Leah, will you tell us about the wave wall and why that's important and why that's something that we have to have in Biosphere 2, but not in Biosphere 1?
Yeah, absolutely. So Biosphere 1, obviously, our ocean is much, much larger than this. And we know when you go to the beach, you experience waves. Waves perform a lot of important ecological functions. So here in Biosphere 2, waves will not occur naturally in this small of a body of water. So the original engineers and designers of Biosphere 2 constructed a machine known as the wave wall, which at the back of the tank here, we have these pistons that slide open and close gates that will allow chambers to open. And on the other side of the chambers, there are huge blower generators that are creating a vacuum inside the chamber. And so that negative pressure created by the blower draws the water upward into the chamber, and the sliding open of the gate releases the pressure and forms a little wave. So we have actual waves on our smaller ocean here.
I think he might have lost them.
Kevin, are you around?
Yeah, we lost connection.
We lost connection with them.
Yes, with them. They should be back again.
Okay, we wait a little bit. Let us digest everything that
Yes,
was
and also
presented.
invite people to make questions. So
Now
there's
it's
already
There's a
one
question
question
in the Zoom meeting.
Hi, everyone. So Kevin is on his way down to the rainforest, and it's likely he either already has or will lose connection while he's on his way down there. So we will connect with him soon once he's in a place with better connection down in the rainforest.
Leah,
Okay.
we cannot see you.
That's because she was using Kevin's camera.
Ah, right.
Okay, so you have to wait until Kevin's back in the other environment because of the connectivity.
Maria is asking, well, let's wait for him to come back, and then Leah and him can answer.
Also, those who are on YouTube following us, please post your questions on the chat, and we will relay to the presenters.
Do you all hear me still?
Yep.
Okay. I can try to answer some questions.
Okay, I think we have Kevin back with us now.
All right, I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, so now we are in the tropical rainforest at Biosphere 2. The ceiling up here is about 30 meters tall. And as you can understand, it is not easy to have plants that look like this growing in the desert in Arizona, which means we need to have appropriate control of temperature and humidity and rainfall. And so there's a lot more rain applied to this ecosystem than other ecosystems inside Biosphere 2 in order to ensure that we can have all of these lush trees and plants with large leaves. So one of the things we can do in here is measure the variables related to the atmosphere using what's called an eddy flux tower. So we can measure wind speed, we can measure humidity, we can measure carbon dioxide, we can measure oxygen levels, and we can do that at different levels of height or elevation in the canopy, all the way up to the ceiling. And these are the same kinds of towers that we use for research out in, say, the Amazon basin as well. And so one of the things we can do at Biosphere 2 is train scientists before they go into the field into what are typically more challenging conditions further from assistance and replacement parts and those sorts of things. Now, none of the vegetation in here was taller than about 2 meters when it was planted in the early 1990s. And so it's really flourished and done well. And we have to go up and we have to trim the vegetation away from the windows on a regular basis so that we have enough light coming in through the glass in order for things that are down in the forest floor to be able to thrive. And some of those things include plants like coffee, which looks a lot like this one here with the bumpy leaves. And coffee was one of the things that was grown at Biosphere 2 that the folks living inside really enjoyed having, although they could only have about 1 cup every 3 or 4 weeks or so. Now, over the 30 years that this rainforest has been growing here, it's been at a higher temperature than the rainforests around the world, which means we're able to look at what does a forest system do in response to future climate conditions. This has been the hottest rainforest on the planet for the past 30 years, especially up towards the top. And so there's some very interesting questions we can ask about how plants function, how leaves function, how the biochemistry changes as you change the temperature, and especially asking that question in combination with drought or lack of water and changes in carbon dioxide, increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And some of the interesting findings are that if you increase carbon dioxide in this rainforest, the plants will increase the amount of carbon dioxide they take into their leaves for photosynthesis. But that only works up to a point. So our atmosphere on Earth is about 400 parts per million carbon dioxide right now. And we can crank the carbon dioxide up inside Biosphere 2 to over 600 or 800 or 1,000 parts per million. And what we see is that going from 400 to 600 parts per million, the plants do a good job of taking up that extra carbon dioxide. But above 600 parts per million, the photosynthetic machinery, the biochemistry in the leaves can't process any more carbon dioxide because it's basically going as fast as it can. It doesn't have capacity to bring in more carbon dioxide. And so above certain levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we might not see the same compensation by the plants around the planet. Now, the other thing that's important to note is if that carbon dioxide is going up and the temperature is increasing, which is what we expect because carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we have put there with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, that carbon dioxide is causing the planet to warm. And at higher temperatures, these plants are trying to protect themselves by creating compounds in their leaves, in their cells, that volatilize. They come out as a gas from the leaves. They're called isoprenes. And these isoprenes are made to reduce the damage from high temperatures to proteins and to DNA. But when they volatilize into the atmosphere, these isoprenes, they contribute to greenhouse gas conditions. So we might get to a point where at higher temperatures and high CO2 levels, the plants are not taking up CO2 as fast as we thought they might, and they are producing things themselves that are contributing to global increases in temperature, global warming. So that's kind of something to ponder as we think about the changes that are going to happen to planet Earth over the next few decades. Now I'm going to check and see if there's any questions in the chat.
There are plenty of comments and some questions, yes.
Okay, let me see if I can find them. Where's my chat? There it is. All right, so there's a great question about one of the issues in the Biosphere 2 early was lack of attention to microorganisms in the earth or in the soil. What was done then and how is it monitored now? Invisible life is vital. Yes, indeed, a great comment. And so one of the things that was done in the early 1990s was very rich soil was put into Biosphere 2. And by rich, I mean it had a lot of nutrients and it had a lot of microorganisms. Now, the designers of the ecosystems at Biosphere 2 knew that the light coming through the glass would not be at the full strength that you get without glass. And so they didn't want growth of the plants to be limited by nutrients in the soil. So they wanted extra available nutrients in the soil. But what that meant was that the microorganisms in the soil that the participant asked about, those microorganisms were super happy at this new moist, constant set of conditions, right, with appropriate water and temperature, and the microorganisms flourished. And because they flourished, they were consuming oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide at a rate that was greater than expected. And the other thing that came into play was the concrete inside the building. So there's a lot of concrete infrastructure like these fake rocks here. And that concrete was still curing when the building was sealed in the 90s. And what it meant by curing was that it was still absorbing carbon dioxide into the concrete. So for several months, the folks inside Biosphere 2 couldn't figure out why their oxygen levels were dropping, although their CO2 levels were going up, and they were missing a chunk of their atmosphere. The carbon dioxide would have gone much, much higher had it not been getting absorbed into the concrete while it was being generated by these microorganisms. And so carbon dioxide levels got up to about 5,000 parts per million, which is more than an order of magnitude greater than what we see on planet Earth. And the oxygen level dropped from about 21% down to 14% because of all the oxygen being consumed by the microorganisms in the soil. And basically the plants weren't able to keep up. They weren't able to produce oxygen as fast as the microorganisms were consuming it. So this isn't something we have to worry so much about today. We don't keep the building sealed, so the atmosphere interacts both inside and outside Biosphere 2 fairly readily for pressure and gas concentrations. But we can still control it tightly enough inside, for example, the rainforest or any part of Biosphere 2 to change things like carbon dioxide concentrations or oxygen concentrations or temperature and look at the responses. And so some of that research I described about increasing carbon dioxide at higher temperatures and while subjecting the rainforest to a drought, those are all things we could do at large scale with a complicated ecosystem of more than 100 plant species and then all of the microorganisms as well. That's something that would be very hard to do anywhere else, but we learned a lot because of it. I hope that helped answer your question. One of the things I'll add just to wrap up that story is when the oxygen concentration got to 14% inside Biosphere 2, the folks inside were having some mental capacity challenges. It was like living, halfway up the side of a mountain. And so oxygen was added to the system about 500 days into the 2-year mission. And that was something that at the time they tried to hide from the public, they tried to hide from the press, and that didn't go over very well with respect to messaging, and it kind of turned the public media against the whole system that was happening here in the early 90s. And I'll just point out that the University of Arizona got involved here starting in 2007, managing the facility, and we were gifted the facility, the 2 hectares and maybe another 15 to 20 hectares surrounding it. We were gifted the facility in 2011, so we've been running it ourselves since 2011. Let me see if there's any other questions. All right, why don't we move back to going towards the lower Savannah. Again, we might lose connectivity for a second, but
There's a
we
question,
will be
Kevin.
back with you shortly. Yes.
There is a question. Maria Eleftherio asked, is it now Biosphere 2 a closed system?
Thank you for the question. Biosphere 2 is not currently a closed system. We can make it almost closed in various places, and we do this by design. It was very expensive to cool the air inside Biosphere 2 when it was sealed. Now we let the hottest air escape out of the very top of the facility. And so that saves us about half of our energy costs compared to what it would cost if you had the system completely sealed up. It's just easier to control and maintain from a maintenance and a cost perspective without having it completely sealed. We could seal it back up, but we can do the science we want to do by measuring, how much air goes in and out of, say, the rainforest in a given day, even without it being totally sealed up. So yes, not a sealed system anymore, but there are pros and cons to having sealed systems. Other questions?
No, so far, no.
Okay, so we're going to move down to the lower Savannah. Leah is already on her way, and I will walk to catch up to her again. I'll probably lose connectivity for just a little bit. Connected?
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Leah's getting connected here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Cool.
Yes, yes.
All right. So welcome to the lower Savannah. So at Biosphere 2, we say we have about 5 biomes here under the glass. And biomes are defined by on the scale of temperature and precipitation. So you can have high temperature, high precipitation. That's a rainforest. You can have high temperature, low precipitation. That's a desert. And Biosphere 2, in order to capture those different biomes that have different temperatures and humidities, the whole biosphere is a temperature humidity gradient, being the most hot, humid in the rainforest, which is back behind me where Kevin just came from, and moving down towards the desert at the opposite end of the biosphere. And as you transition from rainforest to desert, you can capture a lot of in-between biomes, such as a savanna. Savannas are grasslands, and they are more of a temperate, still warm climate. And it's a transition zone to the desert, we have something called a thorn scrub, which is the transition zone between a savanna and a desert. And also on the other side here, we have, we also have aquatic biomes here at Biosphere 2. So in addition to the ocean being our largest aquatic biome, we also have a mangrove. And so these trees here are the mangroves, and they're sitting in water down at the bottom there. And mangrove ecosystems are found in coastal waters. In the US, we've got a lot of mangroves in Florida, also along coasts in Australia, and a lot of tropical regions, subtropical regions. And mangroves are a highly important ecosystem that have been getting more attention for their need to be protected. They serve as a barrier to the coast from things like strong storms and hurricanes to prevent coastal erosion. They're also very important nursery ecosystems, just like coral reefs. Although like coral reefs take up only a small percentage of the ocean size-wise, 25% of ocean life uses a coral reef at some point in its life, usually early in its life as a nursery. Same goes for mangroves. The roots down at the bottom of a mangrove provide a very safe, protective environment for early life of species to ensure they're safe and surviving into adulthood. So mangrove ecosystems are highly important. They also are great carbon capture ecosystems. So they really deserve our attention and protection for conservation efforts. Also in this area, I'm sure if you viewed our videos before this webinar today, you saw the aquaponics system. And today the aquaponics system is not here. This is where it used to be. And today we have, you can see a lot of papayas up here, and lots of different plants that grow food are showcased in this area of the savanna, as the agricultural biome has now been transitioned into a different earth science experiment. So here we have the coffee plant and avocado tree and lots of different plants that are suitable to this biome and environment that we can grow in Biosphere 2 to show how we can grow food in situations like they were preparing for with the original missions, where we want to be able to grow food in controlled environments, possibly on other planets someday.
All right, thank you very much, Leah. And let's give time for people to ask any questions they want. The last topic I want to end with is this idea of ecosystem services or nature services, things that the planet does that we value, that are important for us, but that we often don't pay for. And that includes things like pollinating flowers, right? Roughly half the food we eat requires insect pollinators. And if we didn't have those insects and had to pollinate all those flowers by hand, it would make our food much, much more expensive. And a little side note, Biosphere 2 doesn't have all the natural pollinators that these ecosystems would have not under glass. And we think that because there are so many ants and cockroaches that live inside Biosphere 2, because there aren't other things higher up the food chain, we think maybe those ants and cockroaches are doing some of the pollinating in here, which isn't typical for a lot of these species. But coming back to ecosystem services or nature services, Leah talked about that wave wall, right? So waves are a natural phenomenon in the ocean, as are tides. And those are things that, that keep those marine ecosystems alive, that transform coastlines. And if you don't have those things happen naturally and you want those ecosystems, well, then you have to recreate some of those processes and some of those activities. And that can be very expensive and time consuming. It requires a lot of machinery. Under the 2 hectare Biosphere 2 is about a 1 1/3 hectare or 1.5 hectare technosphere that has all of the equipment and pumps and wiring and sensors and water storing tanks, all the things you need in order to regulate the temperature in Biosphere 2 and in order to produce the rain that comes from sprinklers up in the ceiling that we can turn on and off when we want to. And the reason I'm talking about ecosystem and nature services is because these are the things that our planet provides for us, that if we mess them up, if we damage them, if we get rid of them, and we have to recreate them with machinery, it's going to be very, very expensive, and it's not going to work nearly as well as natural systems do. And obviously, if we were moving to a moon or to Mars in the solar system, we're going to have to figure out how to recreate these processes. And that was part of what Biosphere 2 was originally intended to do, was to try and understand how do you recreate all those ecosystem and nature processes so that different biomes can survive, and we can provide the nutrients and the oxygen and the atmospheric conditions for people to be able to live off Earth. Now I see that there's a question. Let me get to that. Do we grow cereals, corn, or vegetables? That's a good question. So right now, we don't grow much of any of those. But if you look past the glass here, and you see this area that is part of Biosphere 2 that we don't have good connectivity for, so we're not going to go over there. But this is an area that was almost a half-hectare farm when there were people inside, and that is where they grew a number of cereals, as well as corn, as well as vegetables. And some of the things that grow really well under those conditions, it turned out to be sweet potatoes and lab beans. And so those things were some of the biggest portions of the diet of the folks inside. I'm looking at some other questions. Do you have visitors on site? Yes, we do have visitors on site. And yes, there is a risk of contamination, but we've never tried to keep things perfectly sterilized inside Biosphere 2. And in fact, there were a lot of things that were introduced inside Biosphere 2 when we put plants and animals inside in the 90s that were accidental additions that have become part of the ecosystem. And some of those things include some of the ants and the cockroaches. And there were also some octopus that made it inside in the ocean in the early days that were unintentional, because we brought in some coral reef pieces from off the coast of Florida, and the octopus were doing a good job of eating some of the fish inside the ocean, and so they ended up removing the octopus. So insects, my understanding is that they weren't using insects when they were living inside as a protein source, as a food source, but you're absolutely right. That's a very valuable and important food opportunity around the world. And it's something that all of us, if you go back a couple hundred years, we used to eat a lot more insects than we do now. And there are lots of people that are trying to resurrect the insect food industry. It's a lot more efficient at turning things like compost into food that we can eat. And it's much more efficient than, say, growing vegetables and feeding a pig and then eating the pig. You lose about 90% of the food energy from the vegetables when you do that. So it's a very good question. I don't think they were eating many insects when they were inside, but it's an important part of the solution to food challenges going forward. And yes, they're also important for pollination. You're absolutely right. Other questions?
I have one question. What is the maintenance cost of a facility like this?
What is the maintenance cost for Biosphere 2? Well, let me see if I can sort of pull that detail out from our overall budget. I would say it's, well, the energy cost.
Kevin, we cannot hear you.
He couldn't
Sorry, I
share the
lost you for I lost you for a second there.
Yeah, you're back, you're back.
Am I back? Okay. The energy cost, mostly to cool things, is about $500,000 a year. And we have a fairly small staff here. There's only about 4 or 5 people who do a large amount of maintenance. We contract with folks on the outside. So I would say maintenance costs are, you know, north of $500,000 a year. So it's fairly efficient, but it's a building that's 30 plus years old and is showing some wear and tear. And when we have to do repairs and maintenance, it's not like we can buy the parts off a shelf at a store. We have to either special order them or make them ourselves. Question about bees. Can we create all their work with machines? I don't think so. And if we think about pollinating plants, I guess we could get to the point where we could have a whole bunch of little flying robots. That might be one solution. Right now, one of the solutions is we go around with a little paintbrush and we dab the pollen from a flower onto a paintbrush. And then we would transfer that pollen from one flower to another one. And you can see that there's ants walking around on these plants. And we think that the ants are accidentally doing some pollination, for example, of this coffee plant. Yes, if we lose bees in our natural ecosystems, we're in trouble.
What happens if you get a fungus or some bad disease in the plants?
Well, so that was one of the challenges that folks faced when they were inside in the 90s, because they didn't use chemical pesticides. They wanted to not poison their environment because it was a closed system where they
We are losing you again, Kevin. Kevin, we are not hearing you.
It's frozen. Probably will. Yeah, he left and he will join again. So Leah, are you with us? Okay, let's wait a little bit more.
She's still online, but
You all hear me still?
yes,
Yes.
yes.
We lost Kevin.
So if you guys can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. I lost connection on my phone, but let me try and answer that fungus question. I was showing some images of the reproductive structures of a mangrove with fungus all over them and ants. And we definitely get outbreaks of pests. When folks were living inside in the early 90s, they had outbreaks of pests in their farm, and they didn't want to use pesticides to try and control that because they didn't want to poison their atmosphere or poison their water. And so they had to use manual control. We will sometimes introduce things like ladybugs that will eat other pest insects. And so just like in natural systems, it's a little bit of a balancing act. I think there's complex enough systems inside Biosphere 2 that most things don't get out of hand. There are things that will, for example, eat the fungus, like I think these ants are eating the fungus that's on the mangrove. So it's a good question, something to watch out for, and something that actually gets more challenging the simpler an ecosystem is. So if you think about something like the International Space Station, controlling some of the bacteria that grows in there is actually proving pretty challenging, and they have to clean out their
fresh water lines sometimes because they get fouled with bacterial growths and those sorts of things. Other questions?
No, at the moment, no. And I guess we are reaching the hour, but I see some comments and in some things that people are writing here. I think everyone is overwhelmed with the amazing information you're sharing here with us. This is so amazing, so cool. And I think it gives us a unique perspective on how challenging it is to live in another place that is not prepared for us.
Yes. Well, we need to take care of Biosphere 1, our planet Earth. We're still a long way from being successful at colonizing the moon or Mars. There's a lot of things we need to figure out how to do better. And we're learning a lot about our home planet here at Biosphere 2. And we're also learning a lot about what we might need to be able to do in order to colonize the solar system. But colonizing a moon or Mars isn't the solution to humanity's future, right? It's protecting our planet. It's not trying to leave our planet. So with that, we'll wrap up. I want to thank Leah. I want to thank Summer for being with us. And I want to thank you all for being here today and joining us here at Biosphere 2.
Well, Kevin, Leah, and Summer, I can say from my side before passing the floor to Nikos that this was such a privilege to be here with you guys. I feel very honored. It's the second time I see a visit like this, and it's mind-blowing, and I feel like I need to tell this to every random people walking on the street, the things that you are doing and the things that you are sharing with us, because people don't know that. So I can tell you from my side that we will make as much publicity as we can. We already do, but we will do even more to make sure that, the work you guys are doing there make a difference to mankind. Thank you so much for being here with us. It was an amazing journey. Nikos.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure talking with you. Please reach out with any additional questions.
So I cannot thank you enough. It has been a wonderful experience. And it is the essence of what we're trying to do with schools around Europe, provide them opportunities, even virtually, to open their minds and see some very interesting projects. I will make my best to reorganize such a webinar in the new school year. Thank you to all the colleagues from around Europe being here in the Zoom facility and in YouTube. Kevin, Lisa, Summer, thank you once again. And this was it for today. Keep following us through our portal and social media about the new webinars, and keep up the good work. And again, thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
To all the colleagues here in the Zoom meeting and in the